Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of Spits and Suds. This time, a Spits and Suds one-timer, where we sit down with people in the world of hockey and get to know them and talk in depth about their careers and have some fun. And really excited about this episode. I've worked with this man for a long time, and what's really exciting about this interview is some of our better moments talking have been about the great sport of hockey. And as I've promoted this on Spits and Suds, and as I've talked to people around 105.3 The Fan and elsewhere, they say to me, Eric Nadel did hockey? And I'm like, yeah, Eric Nadel was big time into hockey, still is big time into hockey as far as going to the games. And we are so fortunate that he joins us right now. Do you get that same kind of surprise when people find out that previous to the Hall of Fame career that you're currently having, that you were involved with the great sport of hockey?
And those who don't know have no idea and figure that I probably came up through the ranks like most Major League Baseball announcers did by doing minor league baseball games. But in fact, it was minor league hockey that enabled me to get to the point where I got the job doing Major League Baseball, which is crazy and couldn't happen today, I don't think. But it happened some 45 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start at the beginning. Early life, growing up as a kid in New York, the home of an original six team. Were you a big Rangers fan growing up?
Huge New York Rangers fan, and it actually started the year that I turned 8 years old. My dad took me to the old Madison Square Garden to see the Harlem Globetrotters because Wilt Chamberlain played that year for the Harlem
Wow.
Globetrotters. He had left college early and played a year or two with the Globetrotters. So he took me to see the Globetrotters. He'd never been to a hockey game. And over the main entrance to Madison Square Garden was this sign that said hockey, the fastest game on ice. And there were flames coming out of the words. And I said to my dad, I don't know what that is, but I want to see it. And the very next Sunday, he took me to Madison Square Garden, took me right back to that same arena, and we saw the Rangers play the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I just loved it. All of the color, the sound of the skates, the puck hitting the sticks, the guys hitting each other. And then, you're not going to believe this, in the third period of the game, Johnny Bower, who was the goaltender for Toronto, who was not wearing a mask. There was only one goalie back then, Jacques Plante, who wore a mask, and he was with Montreal. Johnny Bower got hit in the forehead with a puck, and it split his forehead wide open.
Oh,
And there was blood all over the place. And he skated off the ice almost as if nothing had happened. And the players skated around in a circle for about 10 minutes. And Bauer came back and played the rest of the game, did not give up a goal. And Toronto beat the Rangers that day 4-3.
wow. Wow.
That whole experience for me was just mind blowing. And I became instantly hooked on hockey. So I'm 8 years old and obviously too young to go to games by myself, and was constantly begging my father to take me to games, just as I was begging him to take me to baseball games during the spring and summer. And we went to a few games. He would take me maybe 3 or 4 times a season. And it wasn't until I was 13 that I was allowed to go on my own, where I could go with friends, get on the subway, ride it in from Brooklyn to Manhattan, which was about a half an hour, go to games, and we would usually sit in the balcony because with our student ID cards, we could get seats up there for $1.
Yeah, I mean, some legendary names from the Rangers days that you were watching. Gump Worsley.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Rod Gilbert was the leading scorer for the Rangers back in those days. Cesar Maniago was the backup goalie, and then when the NHL expanded, he went to Minnesota to the original North Stars. Andy Bathgate was the big star for the Rangers when I started watching them, and he got traded. And I was just devastated. I was just a young kid then, and maybe 9 or 10 years old. And Andy Bathgate got traded to the Maple Leafs. And so I immediately started rooting for the guys who the Rangers had received. I figured these guys must be great. if Andy Bathgate got traded for him, and it was Bob Nevin and Dick Duff were the two forwards who the Rangers got. So they became my two favorite Ranger players because they replaced Andy Bathgate on the roster.
Wow. So then you're growing up, and a lot of people don't know you're an Ivy Leaguer. You're a Brown University guy. What were your choices? Did hockey play a role in that?
Well, hockey played a role. When I was looking for schools, I had gotten some really good advice from Bill Mazer, who had the very first sports talk show, I think, in America. It was in New York. And he had actually been kind enough to respond to a letter I sent him. And he said, when you're shopping for colleges, the most important thing is to get a college with a radio station where you will get to do a lot of on-air work and get to do the things you want to do. That's even more important than going to a school like Syracuse, for example, that had a lot of broadcasting
Yeah.
courses. And as I was looking at schools, and it was a big deal in our family and our community to try to go to an Ivy League school. But as I was looking at them, I was very conscious of, what their hockey team was like and whether they broadcast the games and what their radio station was like. And Brown, as it turned out, had the number one rated uh, rock station, FM station in all of New England at that time. It had a 50,000 watt FM station. And the only times they weren't playing music was when they were broadcasting either hockey, football, or soccer, the three sports that Brown actually broadcast. And they were very good in hockey and soccer, not so good in football. But, it did play a role in my deciding to go there as
Yeah.
opposed to some of the other Ivy League schools.
Kind of an underrated history in Providence, Rhode Island regarding hockey. Just a rich history now with, the Providence Bruins carry it on. And, I want to talk about your first announcing at Brown University, because I will tell you my first experience doing the play-by-play was for UMass, asked to do it in a fill-in role against Boston University. And Eric, at the old Boston University arena, they put us at one end of the rink. I could barely see the players on the other side, let alone the name and the numbers. And this is pre-internet. So, now you can look up and you can see the lines. Back then you had to do a lot of memorization. And I'll never forget, Eric, after the first period, the color guy puts his hand on my shoulder and says, "You want me to take it from here?"
Nice.
And I felt so bad, because I had studied so hard, but at the same time, I had never had those reps to do hockey play-by-play. Fast forward years later, I end up in Houston, and my morning host is a guy named Mark Vandermeer, who at the time of when I was doing fill-in was the director of broadcasting for UMass Athletics. He received all the complaints about a young Gavin Spittle. So when he's sitting in the meeting, he's like, why do I know this program director's name? And then it clicked in, 20 plus years prior, I was the flunky doing UMass hockey. And I say that story, which I still laugh about. How long did it take you at Brown to really get the reps as far as, what it takes to be a hockey play-by-play announcer?
Well, first, let me ask you, were you doing games in the Boston arena that had the egg-shaped rink?
Yes.
Didn't really even have corners?
Yes.
Because we worked from there. Brown played Boston University. BU was really good.
Really good.
And I worked out of that end zone press box.
Okay.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was.
But what happened
unique.
was, when I got to Brown as a freshman, the guy who was doing the play-by-play was a junior. So he had 2 more years to do the play-by-play. So when I came on, they immediately put me on the pregame and the postgame. And in the middle of the season, the color guy, who was a former Brown player named Terry Chapman, decided that he was going to quit and spend more time with his family. And all of a sudden, I became the color guy. But in the meantime, I was going to practices every day and doing play-by-play into a tape recorder of the scrimmages, which, of course, was not the easiest thing in the world because the guys weren't wearing numbers. They were just wearing colored jerseys showing the lines that they were on. We had a yellow line and a green line and a blue line, and the defenseman, was the red pair and the orange pair and the brown pair. And fortunately, I knew what most of the guys looked like and I could recognize them and call the play that way. I also started going to Brown freshman games and broadcasting those games into a tape recorder because they were playing actual games with uniforms and numbers. And I could actually get real play-by-play repetitions by doing those freshman games, which weren't generally at the same time as the varsity games. So I was doing color for 2 years on the varsity games, but practicing on the freshman games. And the guy who was doing the play-by-play, who's one of the best hockey announcers I've ever heard, even to this day, a guy named Jim Shantz, he taught me how to do play-by-play the way he had been taught, which is that it's a series of phrases. And there are a number of ways that you can describe anything that happens. And once you have all of those phrases at your command, you can just plug them in. For example, a pass. You could say, Ben over to Sagan. Or you could say, Ben feed Sagan. You could say, Ben cross ice to Sagan. Ben up ahead to Sagan. Ben drops for Sagan. Ben banks it off the boards for Sagan. Ben whips it off the glass for Sagan. Ben winds it around for Sagan. There's a million ways you can say it. Everything that happens in the game can be described with a phrase. And you just have to command those phrases. The master of that, of course, was Doc Emmerich.
Yeah.
And he would even invent phrases that he would use. Josh Bogorod is very good at
Yes.
being creative and actually inventing phrases. I'll text him all the time and say, "Did you just make that one up?" Listening last night, he said at one point, he said somebody was coming down the right wing, and he said, and he can't turn the corner, which is, it's more of a football expression, but he used that one. And one time he said he runs out of real estate. He's got a great use of the language, and I was taught to write down the phrases that I heard when I was listening to games. The Bruins had a great announcer then named Bob Wilson, who I could hear. I would pick up the St. Louis Blues games with Dan Kelly from St. Louis and Bruce Martin from Detroit, and I would write down their phrases. And then when I was doing these freshman games, I would try and incorporate the phrases into the broadcasts.
Did the theater of mind aspect, which you do so well on Ranger games here on 105.3 The Fan, did that start to incorporate with hockey as well? In other words, when you're on the radio in hockey, it's a little different than on TV. I mean, you have to describe right side, left side, right corner. I mean, it's a description game.
Yeah, and I was really lucky because, growing up listening to hockey, I was listening to Marv Albert, and he was tremendously descriptive as a hockey radio announcer. He had that staccato delivery, when the Rangers had Rattel and Gilbert and Hatfield, he'd say, Hatfield across the Montreal line. And, he would locate the puck for you, and you could literally picture where the puck was going. And the game was significantly slower in those days because he could mention the name of just about everybody who touched the puck. You can't do that now in the NHL. It's just too fast.
Yeah.
And guys don't carry the puck as much. It's more of a pinball machine, the way the puck moves around. But the way he did it back then, you really could picture, where the guys were on the ice.
Yeah. And you had mentioned it, Harvard, Boston University. One of your final years at Brown University, they actually were in the Frozen Four. Boston University in 1971 went on to win, but those were two very tough teams for Brown to face off against.
Yeah, and we did not do well against those. Boston University had a guy named Herb Wakabayashi.
Wow.
Who was really fast, and his name was really hard to say. And they were fantastic. We also made the mistake my junior year of thinking that we could play some of those Western teams. And we started the season my junior year, which was the first year I did play-by-play, the first two games that I ever did play-by-play on, actually on the radio, on a varsity game. We went out to Wisconsin and played the University of Wisconsin, and they just destroyed us. It seemed like the entire game they had a power play, but we were playing at full strength, and we lost like 10-1, and I think they scored in double figures both games. It was just a horrible, total humiliation. And we also played in a Christmas tournament that year at the Olympia in Detroit, which was extremely exciting for me. And we played Michigan Tech and Michigan and got totally bombed out by those teams as well. We were just really, the leagues were not really comparable back then. You know, the ECAC had maybe 3 or 4 teams that could compete with the Western teams, but any team in that Western conference back then, you know, could easily defeat Brown, even though Brown was, you know, a playoff team in the ECAC, just barely. It wasn't the same caliber of hockey. It was much faster out west.
Did Harvard look down on Brown when it came to hockey?
He looked down on Brown when it came to everything. And we actually had good games with Harvard. The Harvard press box was also at the end, was
Yes.
also above one of the goals.
Yeah.
And you know, it wasn't that unusual. We had a they called it a press box, but it really wasn't. We had a table in the first row of the seats right at the glass at in Dartmouth. That's where we had to broadcast from. And not only could you not see from there to do a game, but we had to have somebody guarding our equipment and literally guarding the electric plugs because the Dartmouth students would pull our power on us. And we actually missed an entire period the first time we went up there. And we realized after that we needed to bring a couple of bodyguards to make sure that didn't happen again. But trying to call a game from ice level, you're just making stuff up.
Yeah, yeah. I went in that barn and yeah, just historic and beautiful. Ted Donato, I haven't had the chance to talk to him, and I think I've told you this story. He's the current head coach of Harvard, and a few years back, they had asked him about the 1980 Miracle on Ice, and he stopped them quickly and said, "That's not the greatest miracle on ice." And they said, "We don't. What are you talking about?" And he said, "The greatest miracle on ice is me graduating from Harvard." I want to meet Ted. His son's in the NHL, Ryan. I just want to meet Ted and ask him if that story is true because, you know, it's cool that he went back and now is the head coach of hockey. Don Sweeney, who's the GM of the Bruins, was a Harvard guy. I mean, Harvard's put out some really good. When you think of sports, you know, you don't necessarily, you get the rare Ryan Fitzpatrick who makes the leap, but the Ivy League schools have had success when it comes to hockey as far as taking it to the next level.
Yeah, even Brown. When I was a freshman at Brown, Kurt Bennett was an upperclassman there, and he went on to play in the National Hockey League, I think, for 12 years. And he was the number one dominant player in Eastern hockey, you know, his last couple of years in school. And he had a brother named Harvey Bennett, who went on to play in the World Hockey Association for a while and also played in the NHL. And these guys were huge. You know, they were, you know, hockey players weren't that big back then, but these guys were 6'4" and, you know, 220, 230. And, you know, were just too strong for anybody to knock them off the puck. Kurt Bennett would pick up the puck behind the net. And, you know, he was a defenseman, but he would rush the puck and literally nobody could pull him off the puck. He was that much stronger than everybody else in college. And he wound up playing initially for the Blues and then quite a long time for the Flames, I think when they were still in Atlanta.
Hmm. And so you graduate from Brown, and then your professional hockey career begins, of all places, Muskegon, Michigan, home of the
Yeah,
Muskegon.
Muskegon, Michigan, in the International Hockey
That's
League.
right, the Mohawks, which would be a name that would not exist today.
That's right. They couldn't use it now. They actually had the original name of the team was the Zephyrs because they had a deal with the Zephyr Oil Company, and they bought naming rights to the team.
Hmm.
But when that deal expired and Zephyr wouldn't renew the deal, they changed the name to the Mohawks. And the jerseys looked very much like Chicago Blackhawks jersey. It was an Indian head that was quite similar to the Blackhawks, but not exactly. And the jerseys were blue rather than red. But
Did you?
I was really lucky. When I was a senior at Brown, I sent out an audition tape, a 20-minute audition tape, highlights of a game between Brown and University of Pennsylvania. And I thought it was my best work. And I kept getting these answers back, you know, thank you for your tape. You know, we have no openings. We will keep your application on file. Some people actually commented on the tape, you know, if they thought it was good. I actually have still have the letter from the Dallas Blackhawks where they
Really?
complimented me on the tape, but said they already have an announcer. Years later, I would wind up being their announcer. But in Muskegon, uh, the guy apparently was impressed by the fact that I had gone to an Ivy League school. He was from New Haven and was the guy who owned the team and was tied in with Yale on a number of different things. He was impressed that I had gone to Brown. So he put my tape on the top. And as it turned out, his announcer quit in the middle of the summer, um, largely because this owner was so hard to work for. And the announcer didn't have another job. He just couldn't take it anymore, and he walked out one day. Because when you're doing those minor league jobs, you're not just the announcer, you're also selling advertising and selling season tickets, and you're working year round. And apparently, I don't know what the final straw was, but the announcer just walked out one day, went to lunch, and didn't come back. And the owner, a guy named Jerry, called me up, and we talked on the phone for an hour, and the next day he offered me the job. And
Wow.
I had graduated from Brown a few weeks earlier, was actually working at Brown in my student job, continuing that so I could pay the rent. I was working as a janitor. And I went from working as a janitor at Brown to being the director of public relations and the broadcaster for the Muskegon Mohawks. I think I took a cut in pay. But
Wow.
it was a great opportunity. We broadcast every game. I did the press notes, and I went out as often as I could and spoke to Rotary clubs and little league banquets and anybody who would listen. We had a little video that we showed back then, and I would bring a bag of hockey equipment and put it on one of the people at the meeting, and then bang them with a stick and throw a couple of pucks at them to show how great the equipment was. And it was fantastic, and it was as much fun as I thought it would be. And even though I wasn't getting paid much, it was more than enough to live on. And that's how I got started in this career.
Let's see. I did a deep dive on the. If you had asked me a year ago that you're going to spend time doing a deep dive on the Muskegon Mohawks of the IHL, but if my timing is right with you, Eric, the leading scorer was from Montreal, Canada. And if you remember him, Louis Frijon. Let
Yeah, and he actually said it Freegon.
no way.
Yeah,
Here I
yeah.
am working on my French, and this guy Frigon.
He said Freegon. He was only the leading scorer because the guy who was the most talented player and who had led the league in scoring like 3 or 4 years in a row was named Gary Ford. And the previous year, he had had such a good year that the Montreal Canadiens had signed him and sent him to Nova Scotia, which was their AAA club. And he didn't like it there. He wasn't happy. He was a little guy, and he was getting knocked around up there and really not having a whole lot of success. So the Canadiens made an arrangement where they sent him back to Muskegon. He was still a signed player, but went back to Muskegon. We were allowed to have four of those guys in that league, four guys who were on NHL contracts. And Gary Ford was one of them. So if you have the whole team stats for that 72-73 season, you'll see Gary Ford on there, but he didn't play as many games as everybody else, but he probably had just about as many points.
And this is prior, obviously, to internet, to TV on buses. I mean, how did you spend your time? I mean, did you have to lug a typewriter around as far as putting out press releases as you were the public relations manager as well?
I didn't because we didn't stay overnight. We were doing these bus trips and coming back the same night. Uh, the most of the teams were within about 4 or 5 hour bus ride. We went to Port Huron, Michigan, which is where Doc Emmerich was working. We went to Flint, Michigan, Saginaw, Michigan, Kalamazoo, Michigan, Dayton, Toledo, and Columbus, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the one long trip where we stayed overnight, but just for a weekend, was Des Moines. That was an 8 hour bus ride. So normally we would go on the bus trip, we would come home, we'd get home at some ridiculous hour in the morning. And then I had to be at my desk at 9 a.m. because my desk was closest to the ticket window and I was the guy selling tickets in the morning. We had a girl who came in at noon and would sell tickets the rest of the day. But from 9 to noon, I was manning the ticket window in addition to writing my press releases or doing whatever else I was doing.
I was going to ask you about this in Dallas, and then we'll get, how you got to Dallas. But I'm guessing Muskegon, was Brown also chicken wire?
Uh, Brown had chicken wire uh, when I started, but by the time I graduated, they had glass. Muskegon was chicken wire the whole time I was there. There were a couple of newer buildings in that league. Saginaw was a brand new building. Kalamazoo was a brand new building, and they had glass, but the majority of the buildings still had chicken wire there.
Were there wire marks on the players? Like,
Occasionally, a jersey would rip,
wow.
and there were pinholes in the players in some of those rinks where fans sitting in the first row would bring these long hat pins. And when a player was pushed up against the chicken wire from the opposing team, would stick him with a pin.
No. Wow. Oh,
And, we had all sorts of episodes where players climbed up over the chicken wire to go into the stands after fans. And it was a zoo. I'm sure most people listening to this broadcast, if they're hockey fans and listening to the podcast, have seen the movie Slapshot.
yep.
It was that caliber of hockey, and it was that caliber of travel, and it was that kind of a scene as well in the bars post game. It was crazy. The Muskegon Mohawks were the only professional team in Western Michigan in any sport, and they were gods. And I had never considered when I went out there that I was going to be some sort of major celebrity, but I was. Anybody who had anything to do with that hockey team was a big man on campus in that town.
That's so cool. And from a description standpoint, you hear announcers now say pinned up against the glass. What would you say?
That's a good question. Sometimes we'd say against the fence.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we'd say against the wire.
That's
And
fascinating.
sometimes he would just say against the boards, even though his upper body was obviously not on the boards, but on the wire. And, it was interesting because a player couldn't pass off the glass the way that they do in arenas now. You couldn't bank one off the screen and expect it to go anywhere where you had any idea where it was going to go. That was just not something you could do.
So you start on the East Coast with New York, Brown University. Now you're in Michigan. How do you make your way south to this city called Dallas?
Yeah, well, I was about ready to give it up. Yeah, and I figured if I
Really?
had spent 3 years in Muskegon, which I did, and I couldn't get a better job, meaning in a AAA league, then I must not be very good. And I sent letters with a cassette to 4 or 5 NHL announcers asking for a critique and asking them if I was wasting my time. I did not get a reply from any of them, which was really disappointing. Now, I don't know for sure that they ever received it. I sent it to them, care of their team, but I never got a reply from any of them. So I figured that I must really suck and they don't want to tell me. So I decided that if I didn't get a better job after 3 years, I was going to go to law school. And one weekend when the Muskegon Mohawks were playing in Des Moines, I went to Drake University and I took the LSAT, and I got applications from all these warm weather schools. I had had enough of the snow every day in Muskegon,
Yep.
and I was applying to UCLA and USC and Arizona State. I was going to take a shot at Stanford and Cal Berkeley just in case I could get in, but all warm weather places, Pepperdine. And as I was doing all that work, getting ready for that, I read in the hockey news that the announcer for the Oklahoma City Blazers, which was Toronto's AAA team in the Central League, was giving up the hockey job because he had been hired by Oklahoma University to do their football and basketball, a guy named John Brooks. And so the hockey job was open. And I got on the phone back then. You know, you didn't have cell phones or anything. You got on the telephone. You
Yep.
called directory information for Oklahoma City. You asked for the number of the Oklahoma City Blazers, and the woman answered the phone. And I asked, "Who's your general manager?" And she said, "That's Ray Miron, sir." And I said, "Could I please speak to him?" And she put me through to Ray Miron, who turned out not only to be the general manager but also the coach.
Wow.
And he said, "Yeah, you're actually the first guy to call." He said, "It was in the hockey news this week. You're the first guy to call. The job's wide open. Send me your stuff and I'll get back to you." So I always had a tape made up, you know, in case a job popped up. So I sent him a tape and sent him some of the press releases and program stories that I'd written, since, you know, he told me that would be part of the job too. And he called me back, no, maybe a month later, and he said, "You're a finalist for the job. And what I'd like you to do is fly to Montreal when we have the annual NHL meetings. I think it was the first week in June. And I will interview you and the other finalists." I said, "Great." And so I flew to Montreal. And the first night I was there, he took me out to dinner, and he drank rather heavily. And every time he ordered a drink, I ordered a drink.
Oh,
And we had a really good time. And I remember going back to the hotel room, and I was wasted, but I felt really good about, you know, having
sure.
gotten along with him, and I thought I had impressed him, and, you know, I thought I had a good shot at the job because, you know, since he was coaching the team too, he was looking not just for a broadcaster, he's also looking for somebody who he's going to be hanging out with on the road. You know, the broadcaster and the trainer were the only other two guys who were traveling with the team other than the players. So I went out with him the first night, and apparently there was only one other finalist, and he interviewed him the second night. And he called me about 11 o'clock the second night in my hotel room, and he said, "Hey, Eric, this is Ray. I just want to tell you you got the job."
Oh,
I said, "Wow, that's fantastic." He said, I have this problem though." And he had obviously been drinking a lot again. And he says, "I have this problem though." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I don't know how to tell Mike Emmerich that he didn't get the job."
wow.
And I don't think Mike drinks very much. And I honestly believe that that's the reason I got the job,
Wow.
that he was looking for a wingman on the road who would go out and drink with him every night. And, you know, I've been out with with Doc, and, you know, he'll have a beer or two, but I can't imagine that he had 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 drinks that night as I had the night before. So I'll tell people that, you know, I got a job that kept me in this business because I knew how to drink. And what kids ask me what they should do to prepare for a job in broadcast, I say, learn how to drink. It might come in handy one day.
I'm sure you and Doc have had some laughs about that story.
We've talked about it. Yeah. And as it turned out, it worked out even better for him because he wound up getting a job in Maine with the Flyers Farm Club. And then the following year, Gene Hart, who was their play-by-play guy, I believe he had a heart attack, if I'm not mistaken, but he had to miss some games. And Doc went up there and did the games, and they realized how great he was. And at the end of that season, Gene retired, and Doc became the voice of the Flyers, and that's how his NHL career began.
Wow. And so now all of a
So the
sudden you're essentially in the AAA of the NHL and you're feeling pretty good about yourself.
Feeling pretty good. I'm working for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and we've got players going back and forth between the Maple Leafs and the Blazers. And Jim Gregory, who was the general manager of the Maple Leafs, he was there all the time. And we had uh, first round draft choices playing there. Jack Valaket and Don Ashby, who played in the NHL for a long time. We had Blaine Stoughton, who had played in the NHL for many years and was kind of on the tail end of his career. You know, we had a lot of big name guys in that league, and playing in a first class arena in Oklahoma City that held about 10,000 people and not drawing very well. And at the end of the season, the Maple Leafs decided, and this was a trend back then, that they were losing too much money on their AAA team, and they wanted to share a AAA team, and they were going to share it with Chicago, who had their team in Dallas, the Dallas Blackhawks.
Hmm.
So those two NHL teams decided to go in together on a farm club, and that it would be in Dallas rather than in Oklahoma City. And I got very lucky that the guy who was doing the games in Dallas and also doing the PR, a guy named Frank Falesi, had decided that he was going to leave the hockey club and start his own PR agency. So the job was actually opening up right at the time I needed it to be open. And so they brought me from Oklahoma City to Dallas. And that's how I became the voice of the Dallas Blackhawks in the fall of 1976.
What was it like calling games at the Dallas Fairgrounds?
It was brutal because it was just what we talked about. The press box was on the end,
Yeah,
and players didn't have numbers on the front of their jerseys. And back then, they weren't all wearing helmets. There were still some players who did not have helmets on, so you could see their blonde hair flowing. We had Randy Carlisle back then, who went on to coach for a long time in
sure.
the NHL. He might still be coaching, I'm not sure, but Rick Bowness was playing for Tulsa. He had long hair flowing along, and you could
Yeah.
recognize some guys from their hair. But most guys were wearing helmets, and it made it hard to recognize them when they were heading your way, coming from the other end of the rink. Plus, if there was a scramble in front of the goal on the other end of the rink, you just waited for the red light to go on. There was a phrase that the Rangers TV announcer, uh, the New York Rangers TV announcer, Win Elliott, used to use when I was a kid. And I think it was probably the same thing. He probably couldn't see the puck. He would just yell, right out in front. And then he wouldn't say another word until something definitive happened.
Sure.
Either the light went on and he would yell, score, or he would say, and it's clear to the corner, or it's covered up, whatever it is. But he would just yell, right out in front. Probably a million times that season, I just yelled that out
A-
and waited
And did you
before I
have an
could
analyst
finally
with
figure
you,
out.
or were you solo?
I was solo. Occasionally, we had a player on the injured list who was capable of doing color for me. Most of those guys would have been dangerous to put them on the air. I think the FCC would have stepped in
Yeah.
most cases.
Yeah.
But the best part of it, though, was that a lot of NHL people would come down and they would sit right next to me and usually be available to talk to between periods. Rod Gilbert came down one time, one of my boyhood heroes with the New York Rangers. I didn't even know he was coming. I looked to my right during a commercial break. I said, holy crap, that's Rod Gilbert. And I took off my headset and introduced myself to him. And, he did the between periods interview with me. We had several nights where Bobby Orr came down. Bobby Orr had signed with the Blackhawks and blown out his knee.
That's correct. Yeah.
And they basically sent him all over as a goodwill ambassador. And he came down to Dallas a few times and sat next to me and, also did the between period stuff with me. Every now and then there'd be a scout up there, who would be willing to do some color for me. But for the most part, it was a one-man broadcast.
When you started in Muskegon and then Oklahoma City, now Dallas, you're getting, you're growing older. And was there a maturity as far as your relationship with the players?
It was total immaturity. I was one of them. I was 26, 27 years old, and we were hanging out together. We were all in our 20s, and we were going out and drinking hard after the games and partying. And most of us were single, and we were having a good time.
You were one of the boys.
And one of the boys, and that's still how it is, I think, in most minor league
Yeah.
sports, where the announcer who travels with the team is really considered part of the team. And that's really what it was like, even when I was doing the AAA games here in Dallas.
Uh, the term chirping is used a lot in hockey. It's
Yeah.
trash talking. And, you obviously were around players from different regions. Did you get the hockey vocabulary? Like, for instance, you mentioned Bonus's flowing hair. That would be known as lettuce. Did you have any hockey terminology that was unique to the sport?
Yeah, most of the hockey players' terminology was more unique to the chasing of women outside the sport rather than rather than the sport
Yeah,
itself.
sure,
But there were
sure.
but there was some of it. Yeah, there was some of it. I can't remember specific examples right now, but they had their own terminology. We also had always had French guys. There were always three or four guys from Quebec, whose French was a lot better than their English. And, they had a vocabulary all their own, and they were always fun to talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Blackhawks had a rare rivalry in this region. We don't see it anymore in that they played the Fort Worth Wings. And that was kind of the big rivalry in town. I'm sure you enjoyed doing those games.
It was really heated. That's when we drew big crowds. Neither team drew very well, but when they played each other, they had big crowds. When I got here, they actually had changed the name of the team
The
from the
Texans?
Wings to the
Yeah.
Texans because they had gone from being a Detroit Red Wing affiliate to being a New York Islanders affiliate. And when they became an Islanders affiliate, they changed the name to the Texans. Uh, and their logo was somewhat modeled after the Islanders logo, which had the hockey stick in Long Island. The Texans had the hockey stick in the state of Texas. But those games were wild. There were lots of fights, both on the ice and in the stands. And in my second year, 1977-78, the two teams played each other in the finals for, I believe it was called the Adams Cup. And it went to 7 games at Will Rogers Coliseum in Fort Worth, and it went to overtime. And it was until I did the World Series with the Rangers, it was the single most exciting and dramatic sporting event that I had ever seen live. And it went to overtime, almost through an entire 20-minute overtime, and Fort Worth scored a goal and won the game and won the Adams Cup.
Wow.
And before you knew it, people were jumping out of the stands onto the ice. They were everywhere. The building was just shaking. And I'll never forget that night as long as I live. And that
Yeah.
was the last game that I did as the voice of the Dallas Blackhawks, having them lose in Game 7 in overtime to Fort Worth for the championship.
That was also kind of around the time, take a step away from hockey for a second, that the Dallas Sportatorium was around. And I'm asking you because the Iron Claw is out right now, the movie about the Von Erichs, and they were truly superstars in town. That was kind of a fascinating time. And, we talk about legendary barns in the sport and the Sportatorium, which, was one of those legendary barns for wrestling.
It was. And people used to ask me all the time, whether the hockey fights were staged like the wrestling matches were. I was constantly being asked that because there were
Wow.
so many fights. People didn't believe there could be that many fights just spontaneously, propping up in the course of a game that, specifically wasn't about fighting. I never went to the Sportatorium. As a kid, my dad really discouraged me from watching professional wrestling and kept telling me how it was fake and it was a waste of time and the matches were fixed. And he pretty much brainwashed me against watching wrestling. So I actually never went to the Sportatorium. I'd catch it on TV every now and then with Bill Mercer being
Yeah.
the host, but I never actually went to any of the matches here.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I was a young kid up in Massachusetts, and I could not believe that World Class Championship Wrestling / Texas Championship Wrestling had the budget to go to Uganda to find this amazing man named Kamala, the Ugandan Beast. And years later, I show up in Dallas, Sportatorium gone. I find out that the filming in Uganda was actually on the banks of the Trinity River through the bamboo.
Yeah, I would watch it on TV when my dad wasn't around, and we had a similar guy. We had a guy named Bobo Brazil.
Yes, yes.
He was one of the marquee attractions, and yeah, it really was international. We had a guy named Argentino Apollo, who was from Argentina. There was an Antonino Rocca, who was from
Yep,
some country in South America,
yep.
and we had the Flying Carpentier brothers from Quebec.
Just
They were a tag
legendary.
team.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That is amazing. This is so much fun telling stories with Eric Nadel, the Hall of Fame voice of the Texas Rangers. Okay, let's get into the transition into baseball because, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, everyone thought that you were just a guy who came through the ranks. Little did they know that you went from the Blackhawks to the Texas Rangers, right?
I did. And what happened was after that seventh game of the Adams Cup playoffs, a couple of days later, Jim Gregory, who was the general manager of the Maple Leafs, one of the two parent clubs, walked into my office at Fair Park Coliseum. And he said, I've got bad news for you. We've decided that we're losing too much money here. And the Blackhawks agree with us. We're going to move our team to Moncton, New Brunswick.
Wow.
And I said, "Oh, I spent 3 years in Muskegon. I don't think I could handle a winter in Moncton, New Brunswick." And he said, "You don't have to worry about it. We couldn't possibly hire you in Canada to broadcast hockey games. We
Oh.
have to hire a Canadian."
Oh.
He said, "So start looking for a job." So I got those tapes out again and started sending them out. And in the meantime, the Chicago Blackhawks had a job open. Their announcer was retiring. Lloyd Pettit was his name, and he had been there for many, many years. He was fantastic. And his signature call was a shot. He wouldn't say he scores. It was always a shot and a goal. But he was amazing. Or he'd say a shot and a rebound, and a shot and a rebound, and a shot and a goal. People loved him, and he was retiring. And I was one of 5 finalists for that job. I don't know if they were just being polite to me, telling me that I was one of the finalists, but I was a finalist for the job, and I really badly wanted it, of course. But I was only 27 years old, and the Chicago Blackhawks, they were owned by the Wirtzes, William and Arthur Wirtz. They were very, very conservative. And I really didn't expect that they were going to hire me. And we did some crazy minor league promotions with the Dallas Blackhawks. And the Maple Leafs front office thought it was great. They thought it was really cool. Jim Gregory, who was their general manager, was very supportive. Tommy Ivan was the general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks, and then Bob Pulford came in and replaced him. And they were both very conservative and not so complimentary of all the promotions that we were doing to try and draw people into the games in Dallas. So I didn't expect to get the job, but I was a finalist for it. In the meantime, I was hoping I'd get another minor league hockey job, and there were rumors that the Vancouver Canucks were going to come into Dallas and put their team in Dallas. They had been sharing a franchise in Tulsa with the Atlanta Flames, and there were rumors that Vancouver was going to have their own team and have it in Dallas. So I thought maybe if I just bided my time, Vancouver would come in and they'd hire me to do the games in Dallas.
Hmm.
And then completely out of the blue, I get a phone call from the Texas Rangers director of broadcasting, a guy named Roy Parks, and he says, we really like the way you do hockey games. Have you ever done baseball? And I lied and I told him that I had.
Sure,
Uh,
absolutely.
I'd actually never done them, but I'd listened to a million games. And while I was doing the Dallas Blackhawks games, I was attending a lot of Ranger games and listening to them on the radio and watching them on TV. And he said, "Well, we're looking to hire a young announcer because one of our radio guys, Bill Merrill, is going to retire in a year or two. And we'd kind of like to groom his successor." They also needed a guy to help them sell advertising. And they were looking to hire 2 different people. And as it turned out, they let me audition by doing 4 games into a cassette recorder late in the 78 season. And they listened to the games and they said, you showed a lot of progress. Um, but, I don't know. And I said, "Listen, if you hire me to do the games, I'll do the other job too. And you won't have to hire 2 people." Because in the minor leagues, you always did all the sales anyway.
Yeah.
I was used to doing it. And I didn't mind working in the off season. I had nothing else to do. I was single then, and uh, that's how I got the job. They didn't have to pay moving expenses. I was already in town. I was very well vetted locally in the local media. I had been developing relationships with everybody in the media, trying to get them to come out and, you know, cover our minor league hockey team in a otherwise major league town. And that's how I wound up getting the job. And I was fearful that I wouldn't be any good doing baseball because the sports are so different. So I continued doing hockey. And the first off season, uh, after I did baseball, I did the Fort Worth Texans games. Vancouver did come into Dallas with a team, but they didn't broadcast the games. But Fort Worth, since they had won the championship, all of a sudden got a radio contract, which they hadn't had in many years. And they hired me to do the Fort Worth games. Then the following year, Oklahoma City needed a broadcaster, and I did the Oklahoma City games. So for 2 years after I had already been doing baseball, in the off season, I continued doing the minor league hockey games, kind of as a way of protecting myself in
Sure.
case I got fired, and also because I just loved doing it so much.
Yeah.
It was extra money and it was really fun, and I didn't want to stop doing it. I had such a good time broadcasting those games.
When you got that call that you were going to be a Rangers announcer and you had, after years of being in the minors, you are now going to be in the majors. Was there a moment that you stopped, or was it like, all right, now I have to find another play-by-play gig as well? I mean, did you take it in and say, like, I'm going to the bigs?
Yeah, I was debating it because, at the time, again, I was harboring delusions that I might get the Chicago Blackhawks job, and they didn't seem to be making a whole lot of progress. And I kept actually stalling off the Ranger job, hoping that I'd hear something about the Blackhawks job. And finally, as we got closer and closer to the end of the baseball season, uh, this guy Roy Park said, I'm going to need a decision next week, or else we're going to just have to start doing a search. And the last thing in the world I wanted was for them to do a search and realize how much better every minor league baseball announcer was than I was at doing baseball games back then. And so either way, I figured, well, this is amazing. I'm going to have a major league baseball job. And, that's really when I was a kid, the two things I envisioned doing was either doing National Hockey League or doing Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, this is pretty cool. I'm going to go to Yankee Stadium and I'm going to do games from there. And I'm going to go do games at Fenway, which I had gone to all the time when I was in college, and see these other stadiums I've never seen before. Uh, I might not be any good at it, but let's take a chance, give it a shot, and keep doing hockey just in case. So you've still got your foot in the door there in case things don't work out.
Really is amazing how life works, because I wanted to ask you about the 1980 Olympic team, because Al Michaels is on the record several times saying, like, when they asked, does anyone know hockey? And he said, sure, I do, and I wanted to play this clip, and then because it's so iconic, but I wanted to, I remember where I was as a kid. So I'm going to play the final 10 seconds, and then I want you to tell me, did this call affect you, and where you were when the Miracle on Ice happened?
11 seconds. You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. Morrow up to Schultz. 5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
So, Eric, I had no idea as a kid that was taped and wouldn't work today. And that call and that team really changed the nation, where hockey took center stage and the country was going through a difficult time. And here's this guy, Al Michaels, and there's still that running debate. Did he plan that call? Just kind of an amazing hockey folklore. So wanted to get your thoughts on that iconic call.
Yeah, first of all, when I started watching the Olympic Games and Al was doing them, and I loved Al already as a baseball announcer and a football announcer. I was kind of offended that he was doing the hockey games. I
Interesting.
really thought they should have hired one of the great NHL announcers to do those games. I didn't think he did a very good job of hockey play-by-play. As it turned out, he probably did exactly what was needed for an audience watching the game that didn't know anything about hockey. He probably did it exactly right. But for me, as a hockey announcer and purist, I didn't think he was very good as a hockey play-by-play announcer. But then, of course, I was watching the final game in my apartment here in Dallas. And yeah, the call was just, as an announcer who studies other announcers, it was just so brilliant. The instant it came out of his mouth, it was like, oh my God, that's going to be a classic forever. And it certainly has been. Whether he planned it or not is a good question.
Yeah.
He's awfully good. That could conceivably have come out of his mouth spontaneously. The way Vin Scully or Doc Emmerich, came up with so many gems spontaneously, but that's awfully impressive.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat it because we're talking about this. My partner on this podcast, Craig Ludwig, was actually invited to the training camp for the Olympic team, and it was his birthday that weekend. So he just basically went because it was a free opportunity to drink some beers and party with the boys. And he said somehow a chair ended up through the window. He's one of Herb Brooks' first cuts. And,
Wow.
as he's told me on Spits and Suds several times, probably not the best move in my career.
Yeah. Wow.
But just such an iconic moment. So I wanted to ask you about this. I was actually at this game, and I wanted to know from the man himself, and I'm talking about the famous fight between Rugi Odor and Jose Bautista, if this had a hockey tie-in. So let's play the cut.
Beltre picks to his left, throws to second for one, Rugi to first, and Bautista goes after him, and Rugi pushes Bautista, and they're in a fight at second base. Rugi threw a couple of punches at Bautista, and the dugouts have emptied. This is a real Donnybrook.
So the term Donnybrook, did that come to you from hockey?
Definitely.
Nice.
Definitely. That is sheer reaction. Yeah, when we would have those bench clearing fights in hockey, which happened a lot in the minor leagues, that's what we called them. We called them Donnybrooks. And most baseball fights are not Donnybrooks. They are, as I call them, they are incidents or they're altercations. They are not Donnybrooks, and they're not brawls. They're a bunch of guys standing around, maybe holding each other and maybe not. But this was actually a fight where a bunch of guys were throwing punches and wrestling and actually engaged in combat, which is what a Donnybrook is.
I mean, you explained it perfectly. And
what I wish was I could have seen the actual punch that knocked Batista down.
yeah,
We were a little too far away.
sure.
And I wasn't watching the TV monitor. I don't know that they got it initially anyway, but I couldn't see the actual punch knocking him down. I could see Rugi throwing punches, and next thing I knew, there were just a million people in there, and Batista was down, but I didn't know how he had gotten down.
Yeah. So that's one of those games where everyone says they were there, and I was actually there, but that was a blowout. And I remember Matt Bush taking the mound as I was leaving the game to beat traffic, Eric. And I lived vicariously through you, and I could not believe the chills that were coming through me as you described that. And that goes back to that whole theater of mind where I've always appreciated you is the description of the colors on the uniforms and just the description of the players. I know if they're wearing, mid sleeves or long sleeves. In fact, sometimes I'll speak up at UNT and I'll use your a cut of you as an example because you create that theater of mind where candidly sometimes I think is missing in today's radio. And there's a romance to it as far as calling games through the radio.
Yeah, there certainly is for me, and Gavin, that's how it was for me as a kid. And, part of it, I think, when I was growing up, not every game was on TV. We didn't have color TV. So the games, even when you saw the games, they were in black and white. And even on TV, the announcers would talk about what the color of the uniforms was. So that was just part of the whole thing in painting the word picture. And then as I started, getting schooled on how to do play-by-play, one of the guys who was teaching me at Brown, who was a student, said, that classic thing where when you're a TV announcer, you put captions on pictures, and when you're a radio announcer, you have to create the pictures and, make believe that your audience is blind and they haven't seen these guys, and you've got to describe them. And when I was a kid, we didn't necessarily know what all the players looked like, particularly the guys from the other team. So the announcers would always describe, he's a big strapping fella from Mississippi. He's a big country lad from the hills of Montana, or they'd say, he's a wiry, he's a wiry fella standing far from the plate, deep in the batter's box, hunched over. They were always describing guys' stances and what the pitcher looks like. Again, the sleeves, and is he wearing his uniform blousy or tight, and are his pant legs pulled up high or are they low? All of that creating the picture that the listener can form, in his own imagination. The more detail you give, the better a picture the listener can have. And to me, I think it is getting lost. And a lot of times, I'd say more often than not, when young announcers, send me their stuff to critique, that's one of my most frequent criticisms, is that they're not describing enough.
Yeah.
They're so intent on providing all of the information that's now available for us, and all that stuff is great. I mean, we have so much more we can, tell about a player from the analytics and the statistics and stuff, but they're foregoing the description of what these guys look like, assuming, I guess, that everybody knows what the guy looks like, or how he wears his uniform. And, I'm just not going to make that assumption. I'm still thinking that the first obligation I have is to paint the word picture.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for that rare person to explain to me why the movie was better than the book, because the book, you create the character in your head. And I feel as though you are able to create that character in my head while I'm listening.
That's what I'm trying to do. And, the best compliments we ever get as play-by-play announcers are the ones we get from blind people who tell us, yeah, I can actually envision the field. I can envision everything because of the way you're describing it. Announcers always, when I was a kid, would tell you in a hockey game or a basketball game or a football game, are they moving from left to right or from right to left on your radio dial?
Yeah.
The New York Giants announcer, Marty Glickman, he would always say that. And the Giants wearing their dark blue uniforms are going from left to right on your radio dial.
Wow.
And it was great. It painted that picture. And you'd follow the ball from left to right. And, not many announcers do that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. When you go on road trips to the Blue Jays, do you visit the Hockey Hall of Fame?
I've been there several times. Yeah, I love it. It's, and it's conveniently located. It's a short walk from where we stay most of the time. And I love looking at the wall of masks. That's my favorite room in there, but there are lots of them. And, there are so many players. I've been following hockey for so long now. I remember the older names. I'm more familiar with what those guys did.
Yeah.
The guys in the Stan Mikita, Bobby Hull, Gordie Howe era, where every team in the original six, had two or three guys who went on to the Hall of Fame. I'm actually more familiar with those guys than with, some of the more current Hall of Famers.
Yeah. I still think I can feel a sore on my hand from when I shook Gordie Howe's hand. I mean, it was just, I'll never forget that. And that Like that to me was his message, like I still got a kid.
Yeah.
It
And,
was
the other
special.
thing for me is, my closest friend in hockey, probably in all the years that I did it, was Roger Nielsen. He was our
Yes.
coach with the Dallas Blackhawks my first year. And that was his only year as a minor league coach. He had come from the Peterborough Petes to Dallas to coach the Maple Leafs AAA club. And then they hired him to go to Toronto the next year. And of course, he became one of the legendary coaches of all time. He invented most of the defensive techniques used today. He was the first guy to keep track of hits, face-offs won and lost, um, giveaways, all kinds of things that are normal stats today were not hockey stats until Roger came along and started keeping track of them and telling people about them. But I love going up there and, and he's enshrined in there and, seeing his plaque and reading about the other coaches too. The legendary guys when I was growing up, Scotty Bowman and the Rangers had Emile Francis. Every team had a coach, it seemed, who was there for a really long time. And, I love going up and reading about all those guys. You're making me want to go now. It's funny, Gavin. I just looked at the Rangers schedule the other day and realized that Toronto trip this year is one I might not be able to go on.
Oh,
And now I'm
man.
feeling bad about that.
We'll live vicariously through Jared. I don't know if Jared's been
Yeah.
there yet, but I have to convince, because Jared's a hockey fan and Hicksey's wife's a big hockey. There's a lot of hockey talk going on in the booth.
Yeah, Hicksey did minor league hockey for quite a while when he
Yeah.
was doing baseball in the minors.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to end on this, and we appreciate the time. This never gets old. I think this is probably the 10,120th time you've heard your final call.
2 balls, 2 strikes. Spores kicks and fires. He struck him out looking. It's over. It's over. The Rangers have won the World Series. Ranger fans, you're not dreaming. The Rangers are the World Series champions. After 52 years in Texas, 63 years of the franchise. The wait is over, and the celebration has begun.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Still get chills, Eric. That's a special call. And the fact that it was played all over town and it's just going to live forever, that must be pretty special. And just, take us through that call, but then afterwards, because I know for myself, there are times, Eric, I still don't believe it happened. I
have to be reminded every day.
Yeah, absolutely. We're just so emotionally invested. And then, one of the more special moments on 105.3 The Fan was, Jared on the post game saying how happy he was for you and breaking down. We won't get into Mike Bassick opening up potato chips while that was happening. I don't know if you ever heard that story, Eric.
No.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man, I should have had that cut ready. So if you listen real closely, Jared's doing this massive monologue on how special this is, and you can just hear potato chips opening in the background.
Oh, God.
And, if you know and you love Mike Bassick, that makes total sense. So take us through just that moment. I know you said, in past interviews that you had a feeling they were going to clinch that night. And then just afterwards, did you kind of kick back with Hicksey and Jared and just take it all in the booth?
Yeah. I mean, I just kind of collapsed back into my chair, after I said, and the celebration has begun, and almost tipped the chair over, but didn't. And I just felt just emotionally drained, because that feeling that we all had all along, somehow this is going to get screwed up. Somehow this isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And then they score the 4 runs in the top half of the ninth, and it's a 5-run game, and it is going to happen. And I doubled down on deciding that I had to assure people that they weren't dreaming, that this was for real. But I still felt like I was dreaming. When I collapsed back in my chair, I really did feel that I was dreaming until, Jared started doing interviews with players, and we started seeing the scaffolding being set up for the platform on the field to present the trophy and all of that stuff, which kind of hammered home the fact that this really was happening.
Amazing. Absolutely. And, every year you do an amazing birthday bash at the Kessler. You're a big mental health advocate, and we appreciate that here. And, I'm glad you use 105.3 The Fan as one of your forums to get the word out as far as mental health. You do a lot of charity work in town. You're a big supporter of Jared's Sandlot charity. You came in for KNC for Peace-a-thon, and the guys absolutely love that. So massive thanks, and massive thanks for taking us down this hockey roller coaster of a life that you've lived. We got to baseball at the end, but you know what? I'm kind of glad that baseball took a secondary seat, and because every other day you're a Hall of Fame baseball broadcaster, but it was a heck of a run in hockey, Eric.
Thanks. And, I'm still a hockey nerd, Gavin.
Yeah.
I'm this year, for the first time this year, I've actually started looking at hockeyreference.com.
Nice.
I want to know the face-off stats of the Stars guys. Roger Nielsen hammered that in me so emphatically.
Absolutely.
That
Puck
it was
possession.
so important. And I checked again today, and the Stars ranked 5th in the league in winning faceoffs, their faceoff percentage. Jamie Benn's over 60%. Pavelski isn't having the year that he's had in the past in winning faceoffs. That's how big a nerd I am.
Yeah.
On hockey, that I'm looking at stuff like that. In addition, obviously, to the plus minus rankings and and the goals and the assists. But I love going to the Stars games. I went to my first Allen Americans game last week.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that.
Teddy bear toss
I urge
night.
people to I urge people to go out there. It's a wonderful rink. It holds 5,000. All the seats are great. The game's a little bit slower than the NHL, which actually makes it, for me, a better spectator sport. You can follow the puck more easily, and guys have more of a chance to carry the puck and display their skills a little bit more. And I think that people like there's more hitting, which people tend to like. So go out there. They have a new owner this year, an NFL player named Miles Jack.
Absolutely.
Owns that team.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see he and his mom, who are the co-owners of the team, be successful out there. It's a tremendous opportunity, to see hockey close up. And it's not that far to get to. I live in Dallas, and it takes me a half an hour, about the same thing it takes me to get out to Arlington. If you live in Plano or Richardson or Frisco, anywhere up that way, you're much closer than you are to AAC. So give the Allen Americans games a try. They're a lot cheaper too.
Yeah. Great family atmosphere, and the Americans put on a great show. And super glad that you promoted them, and it's so glad to see that hockey is thriving. I know you don't have the time, like Doc Emmerich did a baseball game for the Pirates, but maybe not play by play. But it would be cool to hear you in an analyst role.
I'll think about that.
Yeah,
it would certainly be fun. I'd have to become more familiar with the players, and I don't know if I have the time and the energy to do that. But
well, as someone
it
once
certainly would be fun.
As someone once told me, all you have to say in between periods, they just got to put more pucks in the net, get in front of the goalie. And this has been special, sir. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it. So great going back and living some great memories as far as your hockey history.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun.
That's going to do it for another Spits and Suds one-timer right here on 105.3 The Fan. Thanks for listening.